What if everything you believe about death is wrong? Not a little wrong, completely wrong. What if there is no moment where you suddenly disappear? No instant where everything goes black forever? No clean ending, like turning off a light? And here's the more unsettling question. What if the thing you're trying to protect, yourself, your soul, your identity, was never actually there? In the way you think? Right now, it feels like you are here, listening, thinking, aware. But what if that feeling is not proof of a permanent you, but just a temporary pattern, appearing and disappearing moment by moment? And if that's true, then death is not what you've been afraid of, because there may be no you there to experience it at all. No darkness, no emptiness, no endless void, just the end of a process that was never fixed to begin with. This isn't philosophy. This is where science and early Buddhist thought start to point toward the same unsettling idea. Nothing is ever truly erased, but nothing remains the same either. So where does that leave you? Not immortal, but not truly gone either. Something in between, something harder to grasp, but much closer to reality. And once you start seeing this clearly, something strange happens. The fear of death begins to change. Not because you found comfort, but because you saw through the illusion. In this series, we're not going to give you easy answers. We're going to dismantle the question itself, step by step, until what remains is something much simpler, much quieter, and much more real than anything you've been told. So if you're ready to look at death not as a mystery to believe in, but as something to understand clearly, stay with me. And before we go deeper, if this kind of content makes you pause, think, or question what you thought was certain, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because we're going much further than this, and what you're about to see next might change the way you experience life itself. Part 1. The ending that never actually happens. There's a quiet assumption most of us carry around like background noise. You live, and then one day, you stop. A clean cut, a full stop, like someone turned off a light. It feels obvious, almost too obvious to question. But here's where things get interesting, because when you look at it through the lens of science, that obvious idea starts to wobble. Not a little, a lot. Let's start with a strange fact. Physics, the most fundamental description of reality we have, never actually describes anything truly disappearing. Not once. Not in classical mechanics. Not in relativity. Not in quantum physics. Not even in thermodynamics, the one field obsessed with decay and disorder. Everything changes. Nothing gets erased. That might sound like a technical detail, but it's not. It's a crack in the way we think about death itself. You take a glass of ice. You leave it on the table. The ice melts, becomes water, then slowly evaporates into the air. Now ask yourself, where did the ice go? Did it stop existing? No, it just changed form. Its molecules spread out, its energy redistributed, its structure dissolved, but nothing vanished. Death, from a purely physical perspective, looks a lot more like that than like a switch being flipped off. And yet, that's not how it feels, right? We don't say, Grandma transformed into distributed thermodynamic states. We say, she's gone. Gone. That word is doing a lot of emotional heavy lifting. But scientifically, it's suspicious. Let's push this further. Every law of physics we've ever written is a rule about transformation. Things move, things interact, things rearrange. But nowhere, literally nowhere, is there a rule that says, take this thing and remove it from existence completely. There's no delete button in the universe, no cosmic backspace key. Even the most extreme environments we know, collapsing stars, black holes, quantum fields, still follow this rule. They scramble, they transform, they redistribute, but they don't erase. So here's the uncomfortable question. If the universe has no mechanism for true deletion, then what exactly do we mean when we say death? At this point, most people instinctively shift the conversation. Okay, maybe matter and energy continue, but I don't. That feels like a solid fallback. Your body becomes atoms in the soil, sure, but your memories, your personality, your sense of being you, that disappears, right? Well, that's where things get even stranger, because even that assumption isn't as solid as it feels. Let's talk about information. In physics, information isn't just abstract, it's physical. It's the specific arrangement of particles, the exact patterns that make something what it is. Your brain, for example, isn't just made of atoms. It's made of incredibly precise patterns of activity. electrical signals, chemical gradients, neural connections. That pattern is you. Or at least it's the closest thing science can point to and say, this is where you-ness lives. Now here's the twist. Modern physics strongly suggests that information cannot be destroyed. Not easily, not accidentally, possibly not at all. It can be scrambled, it can be spread out, it can become so diluted that recovering it is practically impossible. But fundamentally, it doesn't vanish. It just becomes unreadable. Think of it like a message on a piece of paper, then shredding it into a million tiny pieces, then scattering those pieces across the ocean. The message is still there, in principle. Every letter still exists, but good luck putting it back together. Death, from this perspective, isn't deletion. It's the ultimate shredding process. Your biological structure breaks down, your neural patterns dissolve, your information disperses into the environment. Not gone, just impossibly scattered. Now let's pause here, because this is where science becomes strangely aligned and strangely opposed to certain philosophical and spiritual ideas. Some interpretations of early Buddhist thought, especially the more austere, non-mystical readings, argue something surprisingly similar. There is no permanent, unchanging soul. What we call a self is just a process, a collection of changing conditions, a pattern, not an entity. In that view, asking, where does the soul go after death, is like asking, where does the flame go when a candle goes out? It doesn't go anywhere. The conditions that sustained it simply stop. But notice something subtle. That's not the same as saying it was nothing. The flame was real. It just wasn't a fixed thing. It was a process. Now compare that to physics. Physics says there is no permanent object that gets deleted. There is only transformation of states. Buddhist philosophy says there is no permanent self that persists. There is only a flow of conditions. Different languages, different starting points. But oddly, they start circling the same idea. And yet, there's still tension, because science refuses to talk about subjective experience. It can describe your brain, it can describe neurons firing and then stopping. But it cannot answer the most unsettling question: what happens to the feeling of being you? That's where the mystery deepens. And where most people get stuck, because the fear of death isn't really about atoms. It's about experience. The idea that one moment you're here, aware, thinking, feeling, and the next moment, nothing. But here's the twist. Physics doesn't actually describe that nothing. There is no equation that says experience equals 0 after this point. It describes brain activity stopping. It describes systems losing coherence. It describes energy dispersing. But the jump from brain stops to experience becomes absolute nothing. That's not a physical statement. That's an interpretation. And that distinction matters more than it first appears, because it suggests something quietly radical. The sense of ending might not be a property of the universe itself. It might be something the mind constructs. Think about it. Humans are storytelling machines. We divide reality into beginnings and endings. Birth, life, death, start, middle, finish. But the universe? It doesn't seem to care about those categories. It just keeps evolving, continuously, relentlessly, without clean boundaries. We say, she died at 2:47 a.m. But what actually happened? At that moment, a biological system crossed a threshold, a point where it could no longer maintain itself. But the atoms didn't stop, the energy didn't stop, the processes didn't vanish. They just changed direction. So maybe the moment of death is less like a switch and more like a blur, a fading of coherence, a gradual unraveling, not a clean cut. And if that's true, then the sharp, terrifying idea of sudden non-existence might be more psychological than physical. Now, this doesn't magically make death comforting. Let's not pretend it does. There's no hidden promise here of continuation, reunion, or cosmic meaning. Science, if anything, is brutally honest. It offers something stranger than comfort. It says nothing is ever truly erased, but it also says nothing stays the way you want it to. You are not deleted, but you are not preserved either. You are transformed, scattered, rewritten into the fabric of everything else. And here's where the real philosophical tension begins, because now we're stuck between two unsettling ideas. On one hand, there is no clean ending. On the other, there is no stable self to continue. No deletion, no permanent soul, just process. If that sounds paradoxical, good. It should, because both science and early Buddhist thought, when taken seriously, don't simplify reality. They strip away the comforting illusions and leave you with something harder to hold on to, but closer to what might actually be true. So maybe the better question isn't, what happens after death? Maybe it's, what do we mean when we say something ends at all? And that question is where our journey really begins. Part 2, the missing operation, why the universe never deletes anything. Let's take the idea from part 1 and push it to the point where it almost breaks, because if you follow it carefully, it leads to a very unsettling realization. Not emotional, technical, precise, almost cold. Here's the question that quietly sits underneath everything we think we know about death. What physical process actually turns something into nothing? Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, what equation, what law, what mechanism takes something that exists and removes it completely from reality? Take a moment with that, because the answer is not obvious. In fact, there isn't one. You can search through every branch of physics, from Newton's laws to Einstein's relativity to quantum field theory. You'll find equations that describe motion, interaction, transformation, but you won't find a single one that describes erasure. It's like reading the entire manual of the universe and realizing there is no delete function anywhere in the code. Imagine you're programming a simulation. You can move objects, rotate them, transform them, break them apart, merge them. But there is no command that says, remove this object from existence entirely. That command simply doesn't exist. That's not a philosophical claim. That's a technical observation with something familiar, the law of conservation of energy. You've probably heard it before. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. It sounds simple, almost boring, but think about what it really implies. Every bit of energy that has ever been part of you, the warmth of your body, the electrical signals in your brain, the chemical energy in your cells. When you die, none of it disappears. None. It spreads, it changes form, it moves into the environment, but it doesn't vanish. Now zoom in further. Beyond energy, into the deepest layer we currently understand, quantum fields. According to modern physics, what we call particles aren't actually little solid things. They're ripples, excitations, disturbances in underlying fields that fill all of space. So when something disappears at the particle level, what really happens? The ripple changes. It transforms into other ripples. The pattern shifts, but the underlying field remains, always. So even at the most fundamental level, there is no true disappearance, only reconfiguration. Now here's where things get sharper. Let's talk about information again, but this time, more seriously. In physics, information is not just data, it's the complete description of a system, the exact configuration that makes something this thing and not something else. And here's the key point. The leading view in modern physics is that information cannot be destroyed, not just hard to destroy, not just usually preserved, but fundamentally not destroyable. This idea has been tested in some of the most extreme scenarios imaginable, and one of those scenarios almost broke physics itself. Black holes. For a long time, physicists thought black holes might be the ultimate erasers, a place where information falls in and is gone forever, deleted. That idea was terrifying, because if it were true, then one of the deepest principles of physics would be wrong. But after decades of intense debate, the conclusion shifted. Information isn't destroyed by black holes. It's preserved, incredibly scrambled, spread out in ways that are practically impossible to reconstruct, but still there, still encoded in the universe. Let that sink in. Arguably the most extreme object in existence cannot truly delete information. So if black holes can't do it, your death probably can't either. Now pause, because this is where the logic becomes almost uncomfortable. If energy is conserved, if matter is conserved, if information is conserved, if no known physical process performs true deletion, then the intuitive idea that you are erased doesn't match the structure of reality. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Just because something isn't deleted doesn't mean it remains accessible. This is where people often get confused. They hear information is preserved and immediately think, so nothing is ever really lost. Not quite. Imagine again that shredded message. Technically, the information still exists, but functionally, it's gone. Irrecoverable. Meaningless. Physics makes a very sharp distinction between two things: deletion and scrambling. Deletion would mean the information is gone completely. Scrambling means the information is still there, but dispersed into such complexity that no observer can reconstruct it. Death, from a physical perspective, looks exactly like extreme scrambling. Your brain, once a highly organized, low-entropy system, begins to lose structure. Neurons stop firing in coordinated patterns. Chemical gradients collapse. The intricate order that supported your thoughts dissolves. But the atoms remain. The energy remains. The information, in some distributed, encoded form, remains. It's just no longer usable, no longer readable, no longer you in any meaningful sense. And that distinction is where science quietly refuses to comfort you, because it doesn't say you continue, and it doesn't say you are erased. It says something stranger. You are transformed into something that no longer resembles you. Now let's bring in the Buddhist angle, because this is where things start to echo in unexpected ways. Early Buddhist philosophy, especially in its more stripped-down, non-mystical form, makes a radical claim. There is no permanent self, no fixed entity that exists independently of conditions. What we call self is a process, a constantly changing aggregation of sensations, thoughts, perceptions, habits. Like a whirlpool in a river, it looks like a thing, it feels like a thing, but it's actually a pattern, a temporary structure in a flowing system. Now here's the interesting overlap. Physics says everything is transformation, nothing is deleted, but stable structures dissolve. Buddhism says everything is impermanent, nothing has a fixed essence, but processes continue in different forms. Again, different languages, different frameworks, but they start to rhyme. However, and this is important, they are not saying the same thing. Physics does not claim your consciousness continues. It doesn't even define consciousness clearly. Buddhism, depending on interpretation, sometimes introduces ideas like rebirth, but not in the sense of a permanent soul traveling intact, more like a causal chain, a continuation of patterns, not identity. Think of lighting one candle from another. The flame continues, but it's not the same flame. Now compare that to physics. When your body breaks down, your atoms continue, your energy continues, your information continues in a distributed way. But the specific pattern that was you no longer holds together. So in both views, there is no permanent self that survives unchanged. And in both views, there is no true annihilation into absolute nothing. Instead, there is transformation without continuity of identity. Now here's where the tension sharpens, because the human mind doesn't like that answer at all. We tend to want one of two things. Either I continue somehow, or I completely disappear. Both are clean, both are simple, both are emotionally understandable. But reality, if we take both science and careful philosophical inquiry seriously, doesn't give us either. It gives us something in between, something messy, something harder to grasp. You are not a permanent object, but you are not nothing either. You are a temporary pattern in a universe that never stops rearranging itself. And death is not the moment you are deleted. It's the moment your pattern can no longer sustain itself. The structure collapses, the coherence fades. The system disperses, not erased, not preserved, transformed beyond recognition. Now sit with that for a second. Don't rush past it, because this is where the real discomfort begins. Not in the idea of death itself, but in the collapse of the categories we use to understand it. If there is no deletion, then ending isn't what we thought. If there is no permanent self, then continuation isn't what we hoped. So what's left? A universe that never stops moving, never stops transforming, never stops rewriting itself. And within it, a brief, fragile, astonishing pattern that for a while calls itself you. And that raises the next question, a deeper one, a more unsettling one. If nothing is ever truly erased, and if your life is just a pattern in a continuous system, then where exactly are you located in all of this? Not your body, not your atoms, but the thing that feels like me. To answer that, we have to look at something even stranger than death. We have to look at the observer itself. And that's where things start to get really weird. Part 3, the observer illusion. Why ending feels real even if physics never shows it. There's a quiet gap we've been circling around. A gap so familiar, we almost never notice it. It's the difference between two very different ways of describing reality. The outside view and the inside view. Physics lives entirely on the outside. It describes systems, particles, fields, energy, information. It tracks how things evolve over time, cleanly, precisely, without emotion. But there's one thing physics does not describe. Not directly, not clearly, not even close. What it feels like to be something. Right now, as you're listening to this, there is an inside, a quiet, continuous sense of being here. Thoughts drifting, images forming, a subtle awareness holding it all together. Physics can describe the electrical activity in your brain. It can model neurons firing. It can measure chemical gradients. But it cannot tell you why any of that feels like something from the inside. This is what scientists call the hard problem of consciousness, and it's still unsolved. Now, here's why this matters for death. Because the fear of death is not really about atoms. It's not about energy. It's not even about information. It's about this, the idea that this experience, this quiet sense of being here, suddenly stops. That's the real fear, not transformation, not redistribution. Ending. But here's the strange part. Physics never actually describes that ending. It describes the brain shutting down, neural activity becoming disorganized, signals fading, temperature equalizing with the environment. All of that is measurable, observable. But nowhere in those equations is there a line that says experience ends here. That moment, the moment we imagine as a hard boundary, does not exist in the language of physics. So where does it come from? Let's look carefully. Imagine watching a movie. From the outside, it's just light patterns on a screen, frames changing, pixels updating. From the inside, it's a story, characters, emotion, meaning, beginning, middle, end. Now imagine the movie stops, the screen goes black. From the outside, what happened? The light patterns changed, that's all. From the inside, the story ended. That feeling of ending is not in the pixels, it's in the interpretation. And here's the uncomfortable idea. The same might be true for death. The universe keeps updating. Matter rearranges, energy flows, information disperses. But the story, the narrative we experience as me, loses its continuity. And from the inside, that feels like absolute ending. Even if, from the outside, nothing was actually erased. Now let's go deeper, because this is where things start to get subtle. Your sense of self feels continuous, like a thread, a line stretching from your past through this moment into the future. But neuroscience suggests something different. Your brain is not a single unified system. It's a collection of processes, modules, subsystems, different parts handling vision, memory, language, emotion, decision-making. And they are not perfectly synchronized. They constantly fall in and out of alignment. What you experience as a single continuous self is actually a kind of stitching, a narrative your brain constructs after the fact. Think of it like a live broadcast, but with a slight delay and a very clever editor. Your brain receives signals, processes them, then assembles a coherent story and presents it to you as now. But that now is already slightly in the past, already constructed, already interpreted. So even your present moment is not as immediate as it feels. It's a simulation, a best guess, a stitched-together model of reality. Now take that idea and extend it toward death. If your sense of self is a constructed narrative, then the sense of ending might be constructed too. Not fake, not meaningless, but not fundamental. Because the brain doesn't just create experiences, it creates boundaries, beginnings, endings, transitions. It needs them to make sense of the world. Without boundaries, everything would blur together. No past, no future, no identity. So the brain draws lines, clean, sharp lines. This is when it starts. This is when it ends. But reality itself may not have those lines. Let's go back to the moment of death. We say, this is the exact moment someone died. But what actually happens? The heart stops, then maybe restarts, then stops again. Brain activity declines, but not instantly. Some neurons continue firing, others go silent. There is no single, clean cutoff, no universal threshold. Different systems shut down at different times, over seconds, minutes, even hours. So the moment of death is already a simplification, a label we impose. From the outside, it's a gradual transition. From the inside, we imagine it as a sudden drop into nothing. But that inside perspective has a problem. Because to experience nothing, you would have to be there to experience it. And that's a contradiction. You can experience fading. You can experience confusion. You can experience loss of clarity. But you cannot experience absolute absence. So the idea of, I will experience nothing forever, is not something anyone has ever experienced or can experience. It's a projection, a mental model, and that model feels terrifying because the brain tries to simulate it, but it can't. so it fills the gap with darkness, silence, emptiness, not because that's what's there, but because that's the closest approximation it can build. Now here's where things get even more interesting. In early Buddhist thought, there is a similar observation. Suffering doesn't come from reality itself. It comes from how the mind interprets reality. Specifically, from clinging, from wanting things to be stable, permanent, continuous. But everything is changing, all the time. So the mind creates a stable self to anchor that change. And when that imagined stability is threatened, fear arises. In that sense, the fear of death is not just fear of ending, it's fear of losing the illusion of continuity. Now compare that with science. Science says there is no fixed boundary where existence becomes non-existence. There is only continuous transformation. But the mind says, no, there must be an ending. Because without an ending, the story feels incomplete. So we impose one, and then we fear it. This creates a strange loop. We imagine a clean ending in a universe that doesn't actually provide one. Then we fear that imagined ending as if it were physically real. And that fear feels completely convincing, because it's generated from the inside. Now, none of this proves that consciousness continues. Let's be clear, science does not say that. It doesn't promise anything after death. What it does say is more subtle. It says the concept of absolute ending is not something it can define, not something it can locate, not something it can model. And that leaves us in a strange place, because now we have two different stories. The physical story, continuous transformation, no deletion, no clear boundary. The experiential story, a sharp ending, a final moment, a drop into nothing. And these two stories do not line up, not neatly, not comfortably. So which one is wrong? Is physics missing something fundamental about consciousness? Or is our experience of ending a kind of useful illusion? That question is still open, still debated, still unresolved. But here's what we can say. The feeling of ending is real, deeply real. But it may not be a property of the universe itself. It may be something the mind creates to make sense of a reality that never actually stops. And if that's true, then death is not just a physical mystery. It's a psychological one. A place where the limits of physics and the limits of the mind collide. And to go further, we have to follow that collision into something even stranger, time itself, because the way we think about time might be the reason ending feels so inevitable. And once we start questioning time, everything else begins to shift. Part 4, the story we invented, the moment the mind creates a soul. There's a very quiet moment that almost nobody notices. It doesn't happen in a lab. It doesn't happen in a temple. It happens in a living room, in a hospital, in the stillness after someone takes their last breath. The body is still there, exactly the same face, same hands, same weight in the bed. But something is missing, and everyone in the room feels it, not as a concept, not as a theory, as an absence, a strange, invisible gap. And the mind cannot tolerate that gap, so it fills it, instantly, something left. And once that idea appears, everything else builds on top of it. If something left, then it must have gone somewhere. If it went somewhere, then it must still exist. If it still exists, then maybe, just maybe, it can see us, hear us, return to us. And just like that, a complete invisible world begins to form. Not from evidence, but from a single emotional pressure, absence. Now here's the part most people never question. That feeling, that sense that something is gone, is real. But the explanation we attach to it may not be. Let's look at something simple. When a computer shuts down, the screen goes black. You don't say the computer's soul has left. You understand the process is stopped. The structure is still there. The hardware is still there. But the system that made it function is no longer running. Now bring that back to the human body. The brain is not a static object. It's an active system, a dynamic process, billions of neurons, firing in patterns, maintaining a delicate balance. And what we call you is not the hardware. It's the activity, the pattern. So when that activity stops, of course something feels missing. But what's missing may not be a thing that left. It may be a process that ended. And the mind, uncomfortable with processes, translates it into something simpler, an entity, a soul. Now let's go deeper, because this doesn't just happen at death. It happens every night. When you fall asleep, there are moments right before dreaming when your sense of self starts to blur. thoughts become fragmented, time becomes strange, identity becomes unstable, and then suddenly you're somewhere else, someone else, and it feels completely real until you wake up. Then it collapses. Now imagine if you couldn't wake up. Imagine if that transition felt mysterious, unexplainable. Wouldn't it be natural to say, my soul traveled? That interpretation is incredibly intuitive. But intuition is not always truth. Sometimes it's just the brain trying to protect itself from confusion. Now consider something else. Memory. You can close your eyes right now and bring someone back. Their face, their voice, the way they laughed. For a moment, they feel almost present, not physically, but emotionally. And that presence is powerful, so powerful that it's easy to blur the line between memory and reality, especially when you don't want to let go, especially when letting go feels like losing them forever. So the mind creates a bridge. They're still here, not because it has proof, but because it has attachment. And over time, that bridge becomes a belief. Now multiply this across generations. Stories shared, experiences repeated, emotions reinforced, and suddenly an internal phenomenon becomes an external truth, a system of belief, a worldview, a universe filled with souls. Now here's where things take a sharp turn, because if the soul is something real, something independent, something that exists on its own, then it should have properties, it should interact, it should be measurable, it should follow some kind of rule. But every time we try to define it clearly, it slips. What is it made of? Where is it located? How does it interact with the body? No clear answer. Instead, what we find are experiences, dreams, visions, voices, all of which can be traced back to the brain, to different modes of consciousness, different layers of perception. And this brings us to something subtle, but very important. Not all knowing is the same. There is the kind of knowing you're using right now, clear, logical, grounded in the senses. And then there is another kind, the kind that appears in dreams, in imagination, in altered states. It can create entire worlds, entire conversations, entire identities. And when it becomes active, it can feel just as real as waking life, sometimes even more real. So when someone hears a voice or sees a presence, the question is not, is the experience real? The experience is real. The question is, where is it coming from, inside or outside? And that distinction is where most confusion begins. Because once the source is misunderstood, the interpretation follows. Internal becomes external. Imagination becomes spirit. Memory becomes soul. Now add culture, tradition, belief, and the interpretation becomes fixed, untouchable. Now here's the uncomfortable conclusion. If what we call soul is actually a way of interpreting internal processes, then the idea of something leaving the body at death may not be describing reality. It may be describing how the mind reacts to the end of a pattern it has identified as self. And when that pattern collapses, there is no traveler, only silence. But the mind, unable to accept silence, fills it with a story. A beautiful story, a comforting story, but still a story. And once you see that, something shifts, not necessarily toward fear, but toward clarity. Because now the question is no longer, where does the soul go? It becomes, was there ever a separate soul to begin with? And that question is where everything starts to unravel. Because once the idea of a fixed self begins to crack, time itself starts to look different. And that's where things become truly strange. Part 5. If there is no soul, then what continues? There's a question that quietly follows everything we've explored so far. If nothing leaves the body, if there is no permanent soul, if the self is just a pattern, then something feels unfinished. Because instinctively, we still ask, what continues? Not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, a resistance. Because if nothing continues, then everything we do feels fragile, temporary, almost meaningless. So the mind searches again, not for comfort this time, but for continuity. And interestingly, this is where a very different idea appears, not the soul, but something more subtle, something less personal, something almost invisible. In early Buddhist thought, there is a concept that replaces the idea of a soul entirely, not with nothing, but with something called karma. Now, the word karma has been misunderstood so many times, it almost lost its original meaning. People think it's punishment, reward, cosmic justice. But in its simplest form, karma means action and the consequence of that action. not as a moral judgment from the universe, but as a natural chain of cause and effect. Like planting a seed. You don't need a soul to carry the seed forward. The seed carries itself. Now here's where it gets interesting. According to the perspective found in the book Lin Hon Kong Ka by Chung Lao Tik Thong Lak, there is a very direct claim. It is not a soul that continues after death. It is karma, unsimple. But if you really sit with it, it changes everything. Because now what continues is not you, but what you have set in motion. Let's make this clearer. Imagine you light a candle, then you use that flame to light another candle. Is it the same flame? Not exactly. But is there a connection? Absolutely. The second flame exists because of the first, but it is not the first. That is much closer to what this idea is pointing toward, not a soul traveling, but a chain continuing. Now think about your actions, every word you say, every decision you make, every habit you build. They don't just disappear. They ripple outward. They affect other people. They shape environments. They create new conditions. And those conditions create further consequences. You smile at someone, they feel lighter, they treat someone else better. That chain continues. You hurt someone, they carry that pain, they pass it on. That chain continues too. Now zoom out. Your entire life is a network of these chains, some visible, some invisible. And according to this perspective, that network does not stop at death, because the causes you created are still unfolding, not as you, but as effects. Now here's where the idea becomes more radical. In the same line of thought, it is said that when a person dies, the body returns to the elements. Earth to earth, water to water, fire to fire, air to air. Nothing Mysterio comes the deeper point. What we call rebirth is not a soul entering a new body. It is the continuation of karma, the continuation of causes. That sounds abstract, so let's ground it. Imagine a wave in the ocean. It rises, crashes, then disappears. Now ask yourself, did the wave continue? Not as the same wave, but the energy that created it moves on, forms new waves. The pattern ends. But the movement continues. That's the key distinction. No permanent identity, but no absolute stopping either. Just continuity without a fixed self. Now, if you're listening carefully, you might notice something. This idea sits in a very strange place. It doesn't give you immortality, but it doesn't give you total annihilation either. It removes both extremes and replaces them with something harder to hold on to. Process. Now here's where the perspective becomes even sharper. In that same teaching, there is a strong warning. Believing in a permanent soul can lead to misunderstanding reality. And more importantly, it can lead to living carelessly. Because if you think, something of me will continue no matter what, you might ignore the consequence of your actions. But if you understand that only your actions continue, then everything changes. Because now, you are not protecting a soul. You are shaping consequences, right now, every moment, and those consequences will outlive you, not as a ghost, but as effects in the world. Now let's connect this back to science. Physics tells us nothing is deleted. Everything transforms. Buddhist thought adds, what transforms is not a self, but a chain of causes. And suddenly, these two perspectives start to align in a surprising way. No permanent entity, no total erasure, only transformation and continuation of effects. Now pause here, because this is where things shift from theory to something very personal. If there is no soul to protect, then what matters? Not what you are as a fixed identity, but what you do. Because what you do is what continues. Not your name, not your memories, not your sense of me, but your impact. And that can feel both terrifying and strangely liberating. Terrifying because there is no hidden safety net, no invisible you that escapes consequences. But liberating because meaning is no longer something you wait for. It's something you create right now in how you think, in how you act, in how you respond to the world. Now here's the quiet twist. Maybe the question was never, does the soul survive death? Maybe the better question is, what are you leaving behind right now without even noticing? Because whether you believe in a soul or not, your actions are already moving forward, already shaping the future, already continuing beyond you. And that leads us to something even deeper. Because if there is no fixed self and only processes unfolding, then what you call you might not even be located where you think it is. Not in the body, not in the brain, but in the interaction between everything. And once you start looking there, the boundary between you and the universe begins to blur. And that is where the next question appears. If there is no clear boundary, then where exactly do you end? And where does everything else begin? Part 6. Where do you end? The boundary that never existed. There's a question that sounds simple but starts to feel strange the longer you sit with it. Where do you end? At first, the answer feels obvious. Your skin. That's the boundary. Inside is you. Outside is the world. Clean, clear, comforting. But that clarity doesn't survive very long under inspection because your body is not a closed system. Every breath you take brings the outside world inside you. Oxygen enters. Carbon dioxide leaves. With every breath, the boundary shifts. So where are you exactly? Are you the air you just inhaled? A moment ago it was outside. Now it's part of you. A moment later it will be gone again. So does you expand and contract with every breath? Already the line is starting to blur. Now go deeper. The atoms in your body were not always yours. They came from food, from water, from the environment. And before that, they were part of plants, animals, stars. Right now, as you sit here, trillions of atoms are moving in and out of your body. You are constantly exchanging matter with the world. So which atoms are you? The ones you had yesterday, last year? They're gone, replaced. And yet, you still feel like the same person. So if you are not your atoms, what are you? Maybe you say, I am my body. But your body is changing continuously. Maybe you say, I am my brain. But even your brain is constantly rewiring itself. Neural connections strengthen, weaken, disappear, reform. The structure that supports your thoughts is not fixed, and yet you still feel like a stable self. So where is that stability coming from? Let's approach this differently. Imagine a river. You stand at the edge watching the water flow. You point and say, that is the river. But what are you actually pointing at? The water? That water is gone in seconds, replaced by new water. The shape? The shape changes with the current, with the weather, with time. So what is the river? It's not a thing. It's a process, a pattern of flow. Now hold that image, because it might be the closest analogy to what you are. Not a fixed object, but a continuous process, a dynamic pattern of activity. And if that's true, then the boundary between you and not you becomes very difficult to define, because your process depends entirely on the world around you. No oxygen, no life, no food, no energy, no environment, no body. You are not separate from the system. You are a part of it. Now let's bring in a perspective from the book The Soul Does Not Exist by Trương Lao Thich Thong Lac. In that view, a human being is described not as a single entity, but as a combination of processes, often referred to as the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. These are not permanent parts. They are activities. They arise, they interact, they change, they dissolve, and together they create the illusion of a unified self. But if you examine them closely, none of them stays the same, and none of them exists independently. So the idea of a fixed you begins to fall apart, not because you don't exist, but because you don't exist in the way you think. You are not a solid object. You are a temporary coordination. Now let's connect this back to death. If you are a process, then death is not the disappearance of a thing. It is the stopping of a pattern, like a whirlpool in water. The whirlpool looks like something stable, something real, but it only exists because water is moving in a certain way. Change the conditions and the whirlpool disappears. Not because something left, but because the pattern can no longer sustain itself, and the water continues. This is important because it reframes everything. You don't have a self the way you have an object. You are an ongoing process, and that process is inseparable from the world around you. Now, here's where it becomes even more interesting. If there is no clear boundary, then the idea of inside and outside starts to lose its meaning. Your thoughts are influenced by language, by culture, by other people. Your emotions are shaped by experiences, many of which came from outside you. Even your sense of identity is built from interactions, memories, relationships. So how much of you is actually yours, and how much is the world moving through you? At this point, something subtle begins to happen. The idea of a separate self starts to loosen, not disappear completely, but soften. And when that happens, the fear of losing that self also begins to change. because what you thought was a solid boundary was never really there. Now let's return to the question, where do you end? If your body is in constant exchange, if your mind is shaped by the environment, if your identity is a dynamic pattern, then the line between you and everything else is not a wall. It's a gradient, a continuous transition. And that has a strange implication. If there is no clear boundary, then death may not be crossing a line. It may be dissolving into a process that you were already part of, not stepping out of the universe, but losing the temporary pattern that made you feel separate from it. Now pause here, because this idea can feel unsettling or unexpectedly peaceful, depending on how you look at it. If you are not a separate entity, then nothing is being taken away from the universe when you die. Only a pattern is ending, and everything that made that pattern possible continues. The atoms, the energy, the effects of your actions, all still here, just no longer arranged as you. And that brings us to a deeper realization. Maybe the real illusion is not death, but separation. The idea that you were ever completely independent, completely self-contained, completely isolated. Because once that illusion starts to fade, death begins to look less like an ending and more like a transformation that was always happening from the very beginning. And that leads us to the next question. If the self is a process and the boundary is an illusion, then what exactly is experiencing all of this? Who or what is the observer? Part 7, the observer, the one who was never there. There's a quiet assumption hiding underneath everything. Even after questioning the soul, even after dissolving the boundary, even after seeing the self as a process, there is still something that feels untouched, something that feels like it's watching all of this. The observer. Right now, there is a sense that you are here, listening, not just thoughts appearing, not just sensations happening, but someone experiencing them. That feeling is incredibly convincing. It feels like the most undeniable thing in existence. I am here. But here's the question almost nobody asks. Where exactly is this I? Point to it. Is it in your head? If so, where in your head? A specific neuron? A region of the brain? Neuroscience has searched for it and found nothing. Not because nothing is happening, but because there is no single place where a self sits and observes. Instead, what we find are distributed processes. Vision happening here, sound processing there, memory somewhere else, all happening simultaneously. No central controller, no hidden observer, just activity. Now here's where things become unsettling. If there is no central observer, then why does it feel like there is one? Let's try something simple. Close your eyes. Listen to the sounds around you. Notice how they appear. You don't create them. You don't control them. They just arise. Now notice your thoughts. They also appear. You don't decide the next thought in advance. It simply shows up, and then another, and another. So who is producing these thoughts? And more importantly, who is watching them? It feels like there must be something behind them, something stable, something continuous. But if you look closely, that something is never found. Only more thoughts, more sensations, more experiences. The observer seems to dissolve under inspection. Now let's bring this into everyday life. Imagine watching a movie. You become absorbed. You feel like you're inside the story. But at any moment, you can step back and realize, I'm just watching. Now take it one step further. What if the feeling of watching is also part of the movie? Not outside it, inside it. That's the strange possibility we're facing. The observer is not separate from experience. It is part of the experience. A function within the process, not an independent entity. Now let's connect this to a deeper layer of Buddhist thought. In the analysis of mind, what we call consciousness is not a single unchanging thing. It is a stream, moment after moment, arising, passing, arising, passing. And within that stream, there is a function that creates the sense of continuity, a sense that this moment is connected to the last moment. And that function creates the illusion of a stable observer. Like frames in a film, each frame is separate. But when played quickly, it feels continuous. It feels like motion. It feels like something is there. But in reality, there is no single continuous object, only rapid change. Now apply that to your sense of self. Each moment of awareness is like a frame, a snapshot of experience, and your brain connects these frames together seamlessly. So seamlessly that it feels like a single continuous observer. But that continuity may be constructed, not fundamental. Now here's where things become very subtle. If the observer is constructed, then who is asking this question right now? Who is listening? Who is wondering about all of this? It feels like a paradox, because the question seems to require a questioner. But if you look carefully, the question itself is just another thought, arising like any other. There is no separate owner of the thought. Just the thought, appearing. Now pause here, because this is the point where many people resist, not intellectually, emotionally. Because if there is no observer, then what are you? Not a soul, not a fixed self, not a separate entity watching the world, but a flow of experiences, a process, exactly what we've been moving toward. Now let's connect this back to death. If there is no fixed observer, then what exactly ends when you die? Not a soul, not a watcher leaving the body, but the process of experiencing itself. The pattern stops, the stream ends. Not because something escaped, but because the conditions that allowed it are no longer there. Just like a flame, it doesn't go somewhere. It stops when the fuel is gone. Now here's the twist. This doesn't mean everything becomes nothing. It means the process of experiencing as you is no longer occurring, but the universe continues without interruption, without noticing, without needing an observer. And that's where things get strange again. Because if the universe doesn't need an observer, then why does experience exist at all? Why is there something it feels like to be here? Why is there awareness? Science doesn't have a clear answer. Buddhist philosophy approaches it differently. Instead of asking why it exists, it asks, what is it made of? And when examined closely, experience is not a thing, it's an event. Something that happens when conditions are right and stops when conditions change. No owner, no controller, just occurrence. Now return to your own experience, right now. Sounds are happening, thoughts are appearing, sensations are present, and somewhere within all of that, there is a feeling. I am experiencing this. But if you look closely, that feeling itself is just another experience, not the observer, just part of the stream. Now sit with that. Because it shifts everything. The fear of death is often tied to losing the observer, the idea that I will no longer be here. But if there was never a fixed I to begin with, then what exactly is being lost? Not an entity, but a process, a temporary pattern of awareness. And like all patterns, it arises and it passes. Now this may feel unsettling or strangely peaceful, because without a fixed observer, there is no one to hold on to, no one to defend, no one to preserve, only experience unfolding moment by moment. And when that unfolding stops, there is no one left to say it ended, because that statement itself requires the process to still be running. So the idea of I will experience nothing forever was never quite accurate, because there is no I outside the process to experience anything at all. And that realization is where fear begins to lose its foundation, not completely, but noticeably. Because the thing you thought was at risk was never as solid as it seemed. And that leads us to the next question. If there is no observer behind the experience, then what is the nature of reality itself? Is everything just happening? And if so, what does that mean for meaning, purpose, and the way we live our lives? Part 8, Meaning Without a Soul. Why nothing becomes more important, not less. There's a moment when everything we've been exploring starts to turn in an unexpected direction. At first, it feels like we've been taking things away. No permanent self, no fixed observer, no soul that continues unchanged. It can feel like something is being stripped down, like meaning itself is slowly dissolving. And naturally, a quiet question appears. If none of this lasts, then what's the point? It's a fair question. In fact, it might be the most honest question in this entire journey. Because without a soul, without an eternal self, without something that carries you forward, it can feel like everything becomes temporary, fragile, almost insignificant. But here's where something subtle happens. That conclusion might be backwards. Because what if removing the idea of a permanent self doesn't make life meaningless, but makes it more meaningful? Let's slow down. Imagine you are holding something extremely fragile, a glass object, thin, delicate. You know it could break at any moment. How do you treat it? Carefully, gently, with attention. Now imagine the opposite. An object that cannot break, cannot be damaged, cannot be lost. How do you treat it? Casually, carelessly, because nothing is at stake. Now bring that back to life. If you truly believed that something inside you is permanent, untouchable, indestructible, then what is the urgency to live carefully? What is the urgency to be kind, to be present? But if everything is temporary, if this moment will never repeat, if this experience is not stored anywhere, not preserved, not replayed, then suddenly everything matters more, not less, because this is it, this moment, this breath, this experience, unrepeatable. Now let's take this even further. If there is no fixed self, then what are you protecting? Most of the time, we move through life defending an identity, my status, my image, my story. We hold on to them tightly. We react when they are threatened. We suffer when they are challenged. But if that identity is not a fixed entity, if it's just a temporary construction, then what happens when you stop defending it? Something loosens. You don't need to prove yourself constantly. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to carry every past version of yourself forward. Because there is no permanent you to protect, only a process unfolding. And that creates a kind of freedom, not the freedom of doing anything you want, but the freedom of not being trapped inside a rigid identity. Now here's where this connects to something deeper. If there is no soul, then meaning is not something given to you. It's not assigned from outside. It's not stored somewhere waiting to be discovered. It is created moment by moment through action, through how you respond, through how you live. Now remember what we explored earlier. What continues is not a self, but consequences, cause and effect. So meaning is not about what you are, it's about what you set in motion. Right now, you don't need an eternal soul for your actions to matter, because your actions are already shaping the world, already influencing others, already continuing beyond you. And that continuation does not require identity, it only requires cause. Now pause here, because this flips something fundamental. Instead of asking, how do I continue after death? The question becomes, what am I creating while I'm alive? And that question is far more immediate, far more real. Now let's go deeper into something more subtle. If there is no fixed observer, then experience is not owned. It is not mine in the way we usually think. It is simply happening. And that changes how we relate to suffering. Because most suffering comes from resistance, from trying to hold on to what is changing, or trying to push away what is already here. But if everything is a process, then change is not a problem. It's the nature of reality. So instead of fighting it, you can begin to move with it, not passively, but intelligently. You act, you respond, you choose, but without the illusion that anything can be permanently secured. Now, this doesn't make life easy, but it makes it clearer. Because now, you're not trying to build something that lasts forever. You're participating in something that is already moving. And that participation becomes the meaning, not the outcome, not the permanence, but the way you engage with it. Now let's bring this back to death one more time. If there is no soul, no fixed observer, no permanent self, then death is not taking something away from you. It is ending a process that was never static to begin with. And the value of that process was never in its duration, but in its quality, in how it unfolded, in what it created, in what it touched. And suddenly, life is no longer about escaping death. It's about understanding what this brief window of experience is for, not in some cosmic sense, but in a direct, immediate sense, right here, right now. Now notice something. If you let go of the idea of a permanent self, and you let go of the need for something to last forever, what remains? Experience, this moment, unfiltered, unstored, unrepeatable. And in that, there is a kind of quiet completeness. Not because it lasts, but because it doesn't need to. And that realization changes the way you look at everything, because now you're not living for a future version of yourself. You're not trying to preserve something that cannot be preserved. You're not waiting for meaning to appear. You're already inside it, creating it, moment by moment. And that leads to one final question, not about death, not about the soul, but about life itself. If this moment is all there is, then how do you want to live it? Part 9, the fear that dissolves, why death is not what the mind imagines. There is a very specific kind of fear, quiet, persistent, always waiting in the background. It doesn't shout, it doesn't panic all the time, but when it appears, it feels absolute. The fear of not existing, not pain, not loss, but the idea that one day there will be nothing, no thoughts, no awareness, no you. And the mind reacts to that idea as if it's staring into an abyss. But here's the strange part. That fear is built on something the mind cannot actually experience. Let's slow down. Right now, you can imagine darkness, silence, an empty void. And your mind says that must be what death is like. But look carefully. Who is imagining that darkness? You are. Who is aware of that silence? You are. So even when you try to imagine nothing, you are still there, observing it, experiencing it, which means what you are imagining is not actually nothing. It's something, a kind of mental simulation. Now here's the problem. The mind cannot simulate its own absence. It can simulate darkness, it can simulate silence, it can simulate emptiness, but it cannot simulate no observer, because the act of simulation itself requires an observer. So every time you imagine death, you are unintentionally adding yourself back into the picture. And that creates a distorted image, an image of you floating in nothingness, which feels terrifying. But it's not accurate. Because if the process of experiencing stops, there is no one left to experience that nothingness, no one to feel it, no one to observe it, no one to suffer it. Now pause here, because this is where something shifts. The fear of death often comes from imagining an experience that cannot exist. I will be in darkness forever. I will feel nothing forever. I will be gone, and I will know it. But each of those statements contains a hidden contradiction. They all assume that you are still there to experience being gone. And that's not how it works. If the observer is part of the process, then when the process ends, there is no observer left. So there is no experience of nothing, just no experience at all. And those are not the same thing. Now, the mind resists this because it wants something to hold on to, even if that something is fear, because fear still implies existence. But the absence of experience cannot be grasped. It cannot be imagined. It cannot be felt. So the mind keeps replacing it with something it can imagine: darkness, silence, endlessness, and then becomes afraid of its own creation. Now let's look at this from another angle. Before you were born, where were you? Try to remember. Try to imagine it. You can't. Not because it was dark, not because it was empty, but because there was no experience, no memory, no awareness. And yet, that absence did not feel like anything. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't painful. It simply wasn't experienced. Now compare that to death. If the process of experience ends, it would be similar. Not a transition into darkness, but the absence of experience altogether. And that absence cannot be feared in the way we imagine, because fear itself requires experience. Now here's something even more subtle. Most of the time, we don't fear death itself. We fear the idea of death while we are still alive. We fear the anticipation, the imagination, the projection, not the actual state, because the actual state is not something we can ever experience. So all fear of death exists on this side of it, inside thought, inside imagination. And that means it can be examined, it can be understood, and maybe it can soften. Now, this doesn't mean fear disappears instantly. Fear is deeply rooted. It's biological, it's protective, it keeps you alive. But when it comes to death, it sometimes overshoots. It creates a problem that may not exist in the way it imagines. Now, bring this back to everything we've explored. No fixed self, no permanent observer, no soul traveling intact, only a process. And if that process ends, there is no one left to report on it. No one left to say, it was terrible. It was empty. It lasted forever. Those statements require a continuation of the observer, and without that, they don't apply. Now sit with that for a moment, because something quiet begins to emerge. Not a dramatic realization, but a subtle one. The fear of death starts to lose its structure. Not completely, but enough to see through it. And in that space, another perspective becomes possible. Maybe death is not something to experience, but something to understand. Not as an event you will go through, but as the end of the process that allows events to be experienced at all. And that changes the question again. Instead of asking, what will it be like when I die? You begin to ask, what is this experience right now that I am so afraid of losing? Because whatever that is what you actually know. Not death, not the absence, but this awareness, this moment, this unfolding. And once you see that clearly, the focus shifts away from what you cannot experience and toward what you are experiencing right now, because this is the only place where fear exists, and also the only place where it can dissolve. And that leads to something deeper. If fear of death comes from misunderstanding experience, then what else about experience have we misunderstood? And how much of what we call reality is shaped by the way the mind interprets it? That question is where things begin to open up again. Because once you start questioning perception, the world itself begins to look very different. Part 10, the illusion of reality. What you're experiencing is not what you think. There is something even stranger than death, something so close, so constant, that we almost never question it. Reality itself. Right now, it feels like you are directly experiencing the world. Sounds come in, images appear, sensations arise, and it feels immediate, raw, unfiltered. But here's the uncomfortable possibility. You are not experiencing reality directly, not even close. What you are experiencing is a construction, a model, a simulation generated by your brain. Let's slow that down. Light enters your eyes, but you don't see light. You see shapes, colors, objects. Sound waves vibrate in the air, but you don't hear vibrations. You hear voices, music, meaning. Chemical signals travel through your body, but you don't feel chemistry. You feel emotions, pleasure, pain. So everything you call reality is already translated, interpreted, constructed into something meaningful. Now here's the key point. That construction is not optional, it's necessary, because the raw data of the universe is too chaotic, too complex, too overwhelming. So the brain simplifies it. It creates a usable version of reality, not an accurate one, a useful one. Now imagine wearing a virtual reality headset. Inside the simulation, everything feels real. You react, you move, you feel immersed. But you know there is another layer underneath, a deeper level that you're not directly seeing. Now consider this possibility. Your everyday experience is something like that, a controlled hallucination, a stable simulation generated by your brain to help you navigate the world. Now, this idea is not just philosophical, it's supported by neuroscience. The brain doesn't passively receive reality, it actively predicts it. It builds a model and constantly updates that model based on incoming signals. So what you experience is not the world as it is. It's the brain's best guess of what the world is like. Now, here's where things connect back to everything we've explored. If your experience of reality is constructed, then your sense of self is constructed within that same system. The observer, the identity, the feeling of me are part of the model, not separate from it. Now pause here, because this shifts something fundamental. If both self and world are constructed experiences, then the boundary between them is also part of the construction, not something absolute. And that explains something we touched on earlier. Why the boundary between you and everything else starts to blur under close inspection. Because that boundary is not a fixed line in reality, it's a feature of the model. Now let's take this one step further. If your brain is constantly constructing reality, then what you experience is always slightly delayed. Not in a noticeable way, but in a measurable one. There is a tiny gap between what happens and what you become aware of, milliseconds, but enough to matter. Because it means you are always experiencing the past, not the present, and yet it feels immediate. Now combine this with what we explored about the self, a constructed observer experiencing a constructed reality with a slight delay, and somehow it all feels perfectly real, perfectly continuous, perfectly solid. Now ask yourself, what else might be constructed? Time? Let's examine that. We experience time as a flow, past, present, future, a continuous movement. But physics describes time very differently. In many interpretations, time is not something that flows. It's something that exists, all at once, like a landscape. And what we experience as flow may be the brain moving through that landscape, frame by frame, constructing a sense of progression. Now, if that's true, then the idea of a beginning and an ending becomes less clear, because those are features of how we experience time, not necessarily features of time itself. And suddenly, death starts to look different again. Not as a point where everything stops, but as a point where a certain kind of experience is no longer generated. Now bring this back to perception. If your brain is building reality, then it is also filtering reality. You are not seeing everything. You are seeing what is useful. for survival, for navigation, for interaction. And that means there are aspects of reality that you will never experience directly, not because they don't exist, but because your brain has no reason to show them to you. Now, this has a strange implication. The world you experience is not the world as it is. It is the world as it is useful for you to perceive it. Now, combine this with everything we've explored so far. No fixed self, no central observer, no direct access to reality, only processes constructing a model within a system. And that system is what you call your life. Now pause here, because this can feel destabilizing. If everything is constructed, what is real? But here's the key insight. Constructed does not mean false, it means functional. Your experience is real in the sense that it is happening, but it is not a perfect representation of reality. It is a translation. Now bring this back to fear. If your mind can construct reality, it can also construct illusions. Fear of death, fear of nothingness, fear of losing the self. All of these are built within the model. And once you see that, they start to loosen, not disappear completely, but lose their absolute authority. Because now you can ask, is this fear describing reality? Or is it describing how my mind imagines reality? And that question creates space. Space to observe, space to understand, space to not react immediately. Now, here's where everything begins to come together. If the self is constructed, if the observer is part of the process, if reality is a model, then what you are experiencing right now is a temporary simulation generated within a larger system. And when the conditions for that simulation change, the experience changes. And when those conditions can no longer be sustained, the simulation stops. Not because something was removed, but because the process ended, just like we've been circling around since the beginning. Now sit with that, because something quiet begins to emerge again. Not confusion, not fear, but a kind of clarity. You are not a fixed thing in a fixed world. You are a dynamic process within a constructed experience, in a constantly changing universe. And that realization doesn't make life meaningless. It makes it astonishing. Because everything you experience is happening within a system that is far more complex, far more subtle, and far more mysterious than it first appears. And that leads to the next question. If reality is constructed, then is there a way to see through the construction? To experience things more directly? Or are we forever inside the simulation, without ever realizing it? Part 11, seeing through the illusion, the moment the mind stops holding on. There is a quiet shift so subtle, you might miss it if you're not paying attention. It doesn't come from believing something new. It comes from seeing something clearly, not adding more ideas, but removing what was never there to begin with. Up to this point, everything has been slowly loosening, the idea of a fixed self starting to crack. The observer no longer solid. Reality not as direct as it feels. And now, something begins to change in how experience itself is held. Let's look at something simple. Right now, a thought appears. Maybe a question, maybe a reaction, maybe a memory. And almost instantly, something else happens. You grab onto it, you follow it, you build on it, you turn it into a story. Now imagine for just a moment that the thought appears and you don't follow it. You don't push it away. You don't hold on to it. You just notice it and let it pass. What happens? Another thought appears, and again, you don't grab it, you don't turn it into a narrative. You just see it, and it passes. Now something very subtle begins to reveal itself. Thoughts are not continuous. They appear and disappear, one by one. What creates the feeling of continuity is not the thoughts themselves, it's the act of holding on to them, linking them together, building a chain. And that chain is what we call thinking. Now take this one step further. The sense of self is built in the same way. A thought appears, I am this. Another thought, I remember that. Another, I want this. And by linking these together, a story forms, a continuous identity. But if you stop linking them, something strange happens. The story weakens, not because anything was removed, but because it was never solid to begin with. Now here's where things become very quiet. If you observe carefully, experience is just a series of events, a sound, a sensation, a thought, an emotion, each one appearing and disappearing, without needing a central owner, without needing a controller. Now notice something else. When you don't hold on to experience, there is less resistance, less tension, less effort, because most of the tension we carry comes from trying to control what is already changing, trying to hold on to what is passing, trying to push away what is already here. But when that effort drops, experience becomes lighter, more fluid, less heavy. Now, this is not about becoming passive. It's not about doing nothing. It's about seeing clearly, so that unnecessary struggle falls away. Now let's bring this back to something deeper. In certain Buddhist teachings, there is a very simple observation. Suffering does not come from reality itself. It comes from attachment, from holding on to what cannot be held. And when attachment is seen clearly, it begins to loosen on its own, not by force, but by understanding. Now, here's the important part. This is not a belief. It's something you can observe directly. Right now, a thought arises. If you follow it, it grows. If you don't, it fades. No effort required, just awareness. Now extend this to identity. I am this kind of person. I must be this way. I cannot lose this. These are also thoughts, patterns. And when they are held tightly, they create pressure, fear, especially when they are threatened, especially when we think about death, because death seems like the ultimate loss, the ultimate removal of everything we identify with. But if identity itself is not fixed, if it is just a pattern of thoughts, then what exactly is being lost? Not a solid thing, but a process that was already changing. And that changes the emotional weight, not completely, but noticeably. Now something deeper becomes possible. Instead of trying to solve death, you begin to understand experience, because the way you experience life is the same mechanism that creates the fear of death. And when that mechanism is seen clearly, both begin to shift. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting. When you stop holding on to thoughts, something else becomes more noticeable. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of mental noise, a kind of openness. And in that openness, experience continues. Sounds still happen, sensations still arise, life still unfolds, but without the constant layer of commentary, without the story of me being attached to everything. And that creates a different relationship with reality, more direct, less filtered. Now bring this back to everything we've explored. No fixed self, no central observer, no permanent identity, and now no need to hold everything together, because it was never held together in the first place. It was just flowing. Now pause here, because this is where something very quiet but very powerful begins to appear. A kind of ease, not because problems disappear, but because the extra layer of resistance begins to dissolve. Now look at death from this perspective. If life is a process and experience is a flow, then death is not something to resist in advance. It is simply the point where the flow changes, and all the fear we build around it comes from trying to imagine it while still holding on to identity. But when identity loosens, that fear has less to attach to. Now, this doesn't mean fear vanishes completely, but it becomes lighter, less solid, more like a thought than an absolute truth. And that is a very different place to live from. Because now, you are not constantly defending a self. You are not constantly preparing for an imagined ending. You are simply present with what is happening right now. And that presence is not something mystical. It's just what remains when the mind stops holding on. Now here's the final shift. If you don't hold on to thoughts, if you don't build a rigid identity, if you don't resist the flow of experience, then life becomes something else entirely. Not a problem to solve. Not a story to protect, but a process to witness and participate in, fully. And that leads us to the final question, not about death, not about the soul, but about how to live when there is nothing left to hold on to, because that is where everything comes together. Part 12, Living Without Illusion, What Remains When Nothing Needs to Be Held. There is a quiet turning point where everything we've been exploring stops being an idea and starts becoming something practical. Not something to believe, but something to live. Because once the illusion of a fixed self begins to loosen, life doesn't disappear. It becomes clearer, simpler, more direct, but also more honest. Let's begin with something very ordinary. Your day. Waking up, checking your phone, thinking about what you need to do, worrying about what might go wrong, replaying something from yesterday. All of this happens automatically. And underneath it, there is a constant sense of pressure, a need to maintain something, an image, a role, an identity. I need to be this. I can't lose that. I must fix this. And most of the time, we don't question it because it feels necessary. But what if that pressure is coming from something that isn't actually solid? What if it comes from trying to hold on to a self that is constantly changing anyway? Now pause, because this is where things begin to shift in a very real way. If there is no fixed identity, then you don't have to carry it. You can still act, still think, still make decisions, but without the extra weight of defending who you are. Now imagine going through your day without needing to constantly protect an image. Someone criticizes you. Instead of reacting immediately, instead of defending, you simply hear it. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But it doesn't threaten a solid self because that self is not fixed to begin with. Now imagine making a mistake. Instead of turning it into a story about who you are, it's just an event, something that happened, something that can be learned from, but not something that defines you permanently. And suddenly, there is less fear, less tension, because there is less to lose. Now this doesn't make you passive. It makes you more flexible, more responsive, because you are not locked into a rigid identity. Now let's go deeper. If there is no fixed self, then the past is also different from what it seems. We often carry the past as if it is still alive. Memories, regrets, pride. We replay them. We attach to them. We build identity from them. I am this kind of person because of what happened. But memory is not the past itself. It's a reconstruction, a story built in the present. And that story changes every time you remember it. So the past you are holding on to is not fixed. It is being recreated again and again. Now, if you see that clearly, something loosens. You don't have to carry every version of yourself forward. You don't have to remain who you were, because who you were was never fixed. Now bring this into something even more immediate: emotion. A feeling arises: anger, fear, sadness, and usually we identify with it. I am angry, I am afraid, I am sad. But if you look closely, the emotion is just another process. It appears, it intensifies, it fades. And the moment you stop attaching it to identity, it becomes lighter. Not because it disappears instantly, but because it is no longer who you are. It is just something happening. Now this has a profound effect, because much of suffering comes from turning temporary experiences into permanent identities. I am this kind of person. I will always feel this way. This defines me. But when those identities loosen, experience becomes fluid again. Now let's return to death one more time. If you are not a fixed self, if you are not your past, if you are not your thoughts, then what exactly is dying? Not a permanent entity, but a pattern of processes, and those processes have been changing the entire time. So death is not a sudden break from stability. It is the final step in a continuous change. And when you see that, something becomes very quiet, because the difference between life and death is no longer absolute. It is a difference in pattern, not in substance. Now bring this back to living. If everything is changing, if nothing is fixed, if there is no permanent self to protect, then how do you live? Not by withdrawing, not by becoming detached in a cold way, but by engaging fully without clinging. You care, you act, you build, you love, but you don't hold on as if anything can be kept forever. And that changes everything, because now your actions are not driven by fear of loss. They are driven by understanding. You help others, not because it defines you as a good person, but because it naturally reduces suffering. You let go of things, not because you are forced to, but because you see they cannot be held. Now, this kind of living is not something you force. It emerges when illusion begins to dissolve. Now, here's the quiet realization at the center of all this. You don't need to become something else. You don't need to find a new identity. You don't need to reach a special state, because what you are looking for is already happening. Experience as it is, without needing to be owned, without needing to be controlled, without needing to be preserved. And in that, there is a kind of completeness, not because it lasts, but because it doesn't need to. Now sit with that, because this is where everything becomes very simple. Life is happening right now, without needing a permanent self, without needing a soul, without needing to continue forever. And the question is no longer, how do I avoid death? It becomes, how do I live this moment clearly? Because this moment is the only place where anything is ever experienced. And once you see that, you are no longer waiting. You are already here. And that is enough. And yet, there is still one final layer to explore. Because even with all of this clarity, there is something subtle that still pulls the mind back into illusion, something almost invisible. And seeing through that changes everything one last time. Part 13, the final illusion, the need for certainty. There is one last thread, quiet, almost invisible, still holding everything together. Even after letting go of the soul, even after seeing through the self, even after understanding that experience is a process, there is still something the mind clings to. Certainty. A need to know, a need to conclude, a need to say, this is the truth, this is what happens, this is the final answer. And it feels reasonable, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, unstable. The mind wants ground, something solid, something it can stand on. But here's the strange part. That need for certainty might be the final illusion. Let's look closely. Throughout this entire journey, we've been removing assumptions, the idea of a permanent self, the idea of a separate observer, the idea of a soul that travels intact, the idea of death as a clean ending. Each time something falls away, there is a brief moment of openness, and then, almost immediately, the mind tries to replace it with a new conclusion. Okay, so there is no self. Okay, so everything is just a process. Okay, so nothing really matters. Do you see what's happening? The mind is still doing the same thing. It's still trying to land somewhere, still trying to turn fluid understanding into fixed belief. And the moment it does that, the illusion quietly returns. Now it's just wearing a different form. Instead of, I have a soul, it becomes, there is nothing at all. Different words, same attachment, because both are attempts to make reality stable. But reality does not seem to be stable in that way. It is changing, flowing, unfixed. And the moment we try to freeze it into a final answer, we lose contact with what is actually happening. Now pause here, because this is subtle. Letting go of the soul is not the end. Letting go of the self is not the end. Even letting go of identity is not the end. There is still this deeper tendency to grasp, to conclude, to define. And that tendency is what creates the illusion of certainty. Now imagine something different. Instead of trying to arrive at a final answer, you remain with the question, not intellectually, but directly. What is this experience, right now? Not as a theory, not as a belief, but as something unfolding. Without needing to label it completely, without needing to conclude what it is. Now notice what happens. There is more openness, less tension, because the mind is no longer trying to force reality into a fixed shape. Now, this doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you see thinking for what it is, a tool, useful but limited. Thinking can describe, it can model, it can explain, but it cannot capture reality completely. And when we expect it to, we create frustration. Now, bring this back to death. The mind wants a clear answer. What happens after? And it wants that answer to be stable, certain, final. But what if the need for a final answer is the problem itself? Because whatever answer we create will be based on the same limited tools, thought, imagination, interpretation, and those tools cannot reach beyond experience. So any conclusion about after death is still a construction, still a model, not direct knowledge. Now, this might feel unsatisfying because the mind wants closure, but there is another way to look at it. Instead of needing to know what happens after, you begin to understand what is happening now. And in that understanding, the urgency to resolve the unknown begins to soften, not disappear completely, but lose its intensity. Now something else becomes more important. Clarity in this moment, because this moment is the only place where anything is known directly. Everything else is inference. Now here's the final shift. If you let go of the need for certainty, then experience becomes lighter, not because it is solved, but because it is no longer forced into conclusions. And in that lightness, there is space. Space for curiosity, space for observation, space for not knowing. And that not knowing is not ignorance, it is openness. Now return to the beginning, the question of the soul, the question of death. The question of what continues. Instead of answering them definitively, you begin to see them differently. Not as problems to solve, but as invitations to look more closely, to understand experience more deeply, to see how the mind constructs reality. And once you see that clearly, The need for final answers becomes less important because what you were really looking for was not an answer. It was understanding. And understanding does not come from conclusions. It comes from seeing directly. Now sit with that, because this is the quietest shift of all. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a subtle release from needing reality to be something it is not. And when that release happens, something unexpected appears, a kind of peace, not because everything is explained, but because nothing needs to be. And that brings us to the final part. Not about what is true, but about how all of this comes together in the simplest possible way. Part 14, the quiet ending and the way back to this moment. There is something almost ironic about reaching the end of a journey like this, because it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like everything is simpler, not smaller, not less meaningful, just less complicated. All the big questions, the heavy ideas, the search for what continues, what survives, what remains, they begin to soften, not because they were answered completely, but because something deeper was seen, that the way we were asking those questions was already shaping the confusion. Now everything slows down, not externally, but internally. The need to figure everything out starts to fade, and what remains is something very ordinary. This moment, not as a concept, but as something quietly happening, right now. A sound in the distance, the rhythm of your breath, the weight of your body, resting wherever you are, and thoughts still appearing, still moving, but no longer needing to be followed, no longer needing to be solved. Now here's the strange realization. Nothing we explored was about becoming something new. It was about seeing what was already happening, clearly, without adding anything extra, without building another layer of belief. Because every time we tried to understand life, we were adding concepts, and those concepts slowly covered over direct experience. Like trying to see the sky through layers of fog. Now imagine the fog just begins to thin, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to notice the openness behind it. That openness was always there. It didn't need to be created. It only needed to be seen. Now return, one last time, to the idea of death. Not as something distant, not as something mysterious, but as something very simple. A process ending. The same way a sound fades, the same way a wave settles, the same way a thought disappears. No drama, no movement to another place, just the end of a pattern. And when seen this way, it loses its sharp edge. Not because it becomes pleasant, but because it becomes clear. And clarity has a quiet effect on fear. It doesn't fight it, it doesn't suppress it, it simply removes the confusion that feeds it. Now something else becomes more important. Not what happens after, but what is happening now. Because this is the only place where anything is ever experienced. Not the past, that only exists as memory. Not the future, that only exists as imagination. But this immediate unfolding. And once you see that, you stop postponing life. You stop waiting for something to make it meaningful. You stop trying to secure something that cannot be secured. And instead, you begin to participate, fully, in the simplest things. A conversation, a moment of silence, a small decision. Not because they lead somewhere permanent, but because they are complete in themselves. Now notice something. Nothing in this moment needs to last forever to be enough. It is already enough, as it is. And that changes everything. Because the search finally relaxes. Not because it failed, but because it fulfilled its purpose. It brought you back to what was never missing. Now just sit with that. No need to hold on to it. No need to remember it perfectly. Because even this understanding is just another experience. It appears, it fades. And that's okay, because nothing needs to be kept. Now, before this moment passes, before your mind starts to move again, before the next thought pulls you somewhere else, there's something simple you can do. If this video made you pause, even for a moment, if it made you question something or see something a little more clearly, then take a second and gently support it. You can leave a like, not as a habit, but as a small acknowledgement. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to continue exploring ideas like this slowly, quietly, without noise. You can share this video with someone who might be asking the same questions, but doesn't quite know how to approach them. And if something here stayed with you, even just a sentence, a feeling, a shift, write it in the comments. Not to be right, not to prove anything, but simply to reflect. Because sometimes seeing your own thoughts written down makes them clearer, and maybe someone else reading them will see something they hadn't noticed before. Now, there's nothing more you need to do, no conclusion to reach, no final answer to hold on to, just this moment, exactly as it is. And maybe that's where everything begins and ends at the same time.